So with this cycle of lowering interest rates into a recession and increasing them into a boom, they just keep allowing more and more bad debt to accumulate until we get to the point where we're at 80% private debt to GDP and 130% public debt to GDP in the US. And there's so much debt that the system starts to fall apart every time we hike. And that's where the Fed has to cut. We have a Fed meeting today. They're cutting again. They just cut 25 basis points. Why? We're not in a recession. There's no banking panic that they're talking about. We're lowering because the system cannot handle this, right? The Treasury itself is straining. And so it's just their game. And the problem is that this game is terminal because it eventually means that the system is so indebted that nothing can save it except for QE infinity.
When you have a monetary system that has no limits on how much can be printed, the only way to really establish long-term security for yourself and other generations is to just hoard as many assets as possible. As many real assets, whether they're cash flow producing or whether they have just good speculative value, just accrue as many of them as possible. So they set up a world where greed is the only way to essentially make it. You have to be greedy. You can't be selfless, because if you're selfless, you're going to be poor. And so what they turn money into a drug, essentially, that you have to acquire at all costs. And there's never too much of it. You have to keep accumulating more, because if you sit, once you're satisfied with your, couple million cash, guess what? After a couple of years, your purchasing power is eradicated.
I've come to the conclusion that, there is no way to fix it within the system, because it's humans and human incentives and human desires that ultimately shape the system. That's why Bitcoin is so brilliant, is because it removes humans from the monetary system for the first time in all history.
Greetings and salutations, my fellow plebs. My name is Walker, and this is the Bitcoin Podcast. The Bitcoin time chain is 875347, and the value of one Bitcoin is still one Bitcoin. Today's episode is Bitcoin Talk, where I talk with my guests about Bitcoin and whatever else comes up. And today, those guests are Julian Figueroa and Peruvian Bull. Julian and Peruvian have a documentary coming out on December 23rd about Jekyll Island and the creation of the Federal Reserve, which they worked on with Isabella Santos and Carroll. This was a fascinating discussion, and we go deep, deep down into the dark history of the Federal Reserve's creation on Jekyll Island, the immediate aftermath and the Fed's historical track record, the damage that the Fed has done from wars to inflation, booms and busts, inequality, and a whole lot more. We also get into countries adopting a Bitcoin strategic reserve, what that means for fiat currencies down the line, and why individuals need to understand Bitcoin now more than ever. I saw an early cut of the film, and it is awesome. Head to the show notes to grab links to watch the film on GetBase TV when it comes out. Before we dive in, do me a favor and subscribe to the Bitcoin Podcast wherever you're watching or listening, but I personally recommend you listen on fountain.fm, because not only can you send Bitcoin to your favorite podcasters to give value for value, but you can earn Bitcoin just for listening to podcasts. Check out bitcoinpodcast.net for episodes and additional resources. Head to the show notes to grab discount links for my sponsor Bitbox, or go directly to bitbox.swiss/Walker and use promo code Walker for 5% off the fully open source Bitcoin-only Bitbox02 hardware wallet. Send an email to hello@bitcoinpodcast.net if you have feedback or if you're interested in sponsoring the Bitcoin Podcast. And if you find this show valuable, consider giving value back by giving it a zap on Nostr or a boost on Fountain. I truly appreciate it. Without further ado, let's get into this Bitcoin Talk with Julian and Peruvian. Good to be here with you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
thanks
it's
for having
my
us.
pleasure. This is the hack of Bitcoin podcasting, is like I really just did this because I wanted a chance to shoot the shit with Bitcoiners and have an excuse to do that. And so it works out pretty well in that regard. All right. We are good to go now. And look at that. You know what I love about Nostr is that we're on, it's a random Wednesday afternoon. We've got like 20 some people in here already. Hello to all of you who joined. It's a beautiful thing. People just coming and hanging out. But we have some fun topics to discuss today. Actually, I don't know if they're fun in like a sort of a morbid way. I suppose. Like, like it's like fun in the way that like a car crash is fun, I guess, if you're not in it. But this is kind of like a giant car crash that we're all in, and only some people are paying attention to. So I'm pretty excited to dig into this with you guys. You're, just for everyone's knowledge, the documentary, the film that you guys created is coming out when? For like official release?
I'm really aiming for December 23rd. We're waiting on one more party to with the edit. But if it's not December 23rd, it'll be very soon after. So in the next week, hopefully.
Okay. Well, I'm stoked. I think it's coming at a good time. I mean, it's a perfect bit of light viewing to do with your family around the Christmas tree. You know what I mean? Learn about Jekyll Island and the Federal Reserve. Like, what could make the holidays any better than that?
It's the 111th birthday of the Federal Reserve on December 23rd this year.
Man, happy birthday.
I believe I have that right.
Yeah, that would make sense. 1913 to 2024. Yeah. Fuck. You know what's okay? I'm trying to figure out like where even to start with this, because there's a lot. Maybe a good place to start is just with you guys. How did you guys end up making a documentary together? Also with Isabella and Carroll, and you had some other folks contributing as well. But you decided to make a documentary about Jekyll Island and the Federal Reserve, and actually go to Jekyll Island for this. Like, how did you guys all get together and decide, yeah, we should just, like, fuck it, we'll just go do this?
I've always, I've known the story, and a lot of Bitcoiners know the story, and it's one of those things where there's a couple books in the Bitcoin space where you just say the name, and people kind of just take your word, and then they read the book. Like, everyone says, oh, if you have a problem understanding, Bitcoin, block stuff, go read, the block size wars. I'm like, yeah, but, what does that mean? And it's the same with, if you want to understand the Fed, read The Creature from Jekyll Island. And I'm like, yeah, but, what does that mean? Why do they call that book that? And the book is amazing, but it's very, very long. It's about 300-400 pages. It's super, super dense. But essentially, the idea is that the inception of the Federal Reserve started because of a meeting on this island in southern Georgia called Jekyll Island. And I always thought, why that specific place? Why, it's an interesting name, because if you know about Jekyll and Hyde, and even though that actually has nothing to do with the naming of the island, you think, oh, that's kind of a sanctimonious place to have such a meeting with such dire consequences for the rest of the world. And so I thought, well, could I learn anything more about the origin of the Fed by just going there? That was kind of this grand experiment I had. And then I kind of thought this whole creation of the Fed was sort of a joint effort between multiple parties. And I thought, well, the best way to probably explore the origins of the Federal Reserve wouldn't be for me to just go there on my own, or maybe just me and Isabella. It would be to try and get some other perspectives on this too, and kind of round out our crew. And so it started with us first messaging Ian to be a part of this. If you don't know Ian Carroll, he does a lot of these great conspiracy breakdowns, but he gets in really deep to the links between, pharmaceutical companies and advertising and what's going on with P. Diddy and all this stuff. And he's just super analytical in the way that he breaks these things down. And he's got a nice touch of sarcasm to it. So I reached out to him and said, you should come join us. And then Peruvian Bull is actually, I believe, you're pretty close with Ian. And so he, I guess, told you that he was doing this, and you reached out to me. And I was actually familiar with your work because you've done some excellent deep dives into the Fed. And I was like, absolutely got to have you. And then we even had a fifth person tag along named Mark, who had met Isabella at a previous event, and he was super well informed about the Fed as well. So he's part of this. And what came together is basically this group of 6 of us, if you include my girlfriend Makiko, who did a lot of the cinematography, just walking around the island, taking in the ambiance, learning some interesting things about the history of the island and how it all connects basically to the origins of the most criminal enterprise on planet Earth.
What an intro. Yeah. You guys. So I thought going in, I've watched now the rough cut you sent me twice now, just because the first time I was just watching it to experience it, and the second time I'm watching it to try and kind of prep for this this discussion. And I learned a number of things. I thought I was fairly well informed about the Fed, about the whole Jekyll Island thing, everything. There were some nuances and some, well, not so fun facts that I just had like no idea about. And I think this film is coming at a really nice time. I mean, there's a Fed, an FOMC press conference today, I believe. It might be happening right now, actually, as we're recording this, I believe. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's perfect time. And Fed's birthday coming up, and people all over the country and all over the world feeling the pain of inflation more and more year after year after year. And so, maybe a place to kind of kick this off a little bit is just like, how did you guys approach the topic of telling this story about the Fed? Because there is a lot to get into. There's a lot like just with Jekyll Island, but you guys kind of went broader than that. You talked more about the other downstream impacts of the Fed. How did you figure out like how to really structure this so that it would be an effective kind of educational tool? But of course, it has to be entertaining too, right? Mm-hmm. Like otherwise, let's be real, people's attention spans are like goldfish and they just will tune right out.
I'll try not to take up all the airtime here and pass it to Peruvian, but essentially, for me, it was like there's three acts to the film. It's like why did this Fed form in the first place, and what do you need to know about central banking in general? Because the Federal Reserve is not the first central bank. What was the immediate aftermath? How could we tell what the impact of the Fed was? And you can just see it throughout history. And then like, what does it mean for the average person? And yeah, I know, Peruvian brings like a ton to the table on this. I'll just pass it to you as in terms of, I guess, figuring out like, how did we figure out what to talk about here?
Yeah, I mean, this was the challenge, right? Because the story is so complex, and you could talk about the Fed for probably 10 hours and still not fully grasp the entire story. And because I came kind of later on, it was, I had to kind of get myself up to speed. I had known Carroll for like the last year and a half or so, even before he blew up, just because he lives in my area and we're both content creators. And so we'd linked up a few times and chatted. And he had reached out to me and said, hey, I'm doing the documentary. This is going to be really cool. It's right after the Bitcoin conference. And I was already going to the conference to talk. And so I was like, I'm going to let me tag along. Like, do you guys need some more economic analysis and economic history to add on to this? And Julian was kind enough to absolutely agree with that. And we wanted to when we were thinking about how to like set the stage, we wanted to give a little bit of the backdrop of the story of why the Fed was founded, go into the actual history of the founding, how these men basically got into this train car in northeastern the U.S. and then secretly made it their way down to Jekyll Island and had this meeting on this like nondescript island. And immediately what I wanted to touch on was, the issues with the banking system pre 1913, like the 1907 banking panic, the 1893 banking panic. And then, the rationale and the arguments that these, economic actors, right, the Paul Warburgs and the J.P. Morgans were able to use to further their cause. Because when you look into this, right, like when you're trying to convince a large section of Congress for basically any policy, you need usually to have intelligent arguments on your side. Money and lobbying will go a certain way, but at a certain point you want to convince the general public, and so you need to have arguments. And so what they did was ingenious. These people funded institutes and research programs to produce papers that argued for the existence of a Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, they changed their structure several times until they got to their final structure in 1913. And even then, as we're talking, right, we're coming up on the anniversary, when they actually passed the bill for the creation of the Federal Reserve in December 1913, they did so with a third of the Senate and about a quarter of the House gone because of holidays. So they still had to scrape it through by the skin of their teeth. And once they've created this entity, right, all it's done is grown in power and influence for the past 100+ years. And so I wanted to set the stage and tell that story, but also really focus on the second and third order impacts of the existence of the Federal Reserve, because especially in finance, which is my field, right, like people understand why it exists, but I don't think not enough people understand the effects of what the Fed has done and how this has affected financial markets, wealth gap, right, inequality, and just the broader, right, geopolitical landscape.
Not to mention the funding of forever wars that would likely not be possible without the infinite money printer. And it gets like, I'm glad Bitcoin exists, because if it was only this, if there was just this vacuum and there was the Fed, I think a lot of us would be pretty depressed. So glad that Bitcoin is here to at least bring some hope to the future, because things look pretty dark when you realize the extent to which this centralization of control of money, of the market for money, affects everything else. Like, we can't have a free market when the market for money itself is not free. And I think that people really don't grasp that. And I want to get into a lot of these kind of downstream impacts, because I think that's really going to hit home for folks. But for people who are not familiar with this story, with the players that went into the creation of the Federal Reserve, they think, okay, it's our central bank. Yeah, whatever. It's been around for a while. It's just kind of always been there, right? Can you talk a little bit about what led up? You mentioned, the banking crisis prior, some other events, but how did we get to this meeting at Jekyll Island, and who were these people involved? And I guess what gave these guys the right to decide they were going to be the ones who got to control the money forever?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we can really trace the origins of this back, first of all, to the fractional reserve banking system that existed in the 1800s. Because of the structure of the decentralized banking system, there were always banking panics that had a contagion effect, almost like a virus, right? Because the issue came where, obviously the banks loan out funds that they do not have. That's how banks work, and then they only back those loans, which are liabilities to them or assets to them, but liabilities to the people who owe those loans. They only back those with a fraction of the gold that they have on hand, and so if there's ever a run, that bank immediately faces insolvency, where they cannot get enough liquidity. And where the banking system started to get more and more dangerous in the late 1800s was where they started to use what were called reserve city banks. And so, let's say you're a rural bank in, Pennsylvania, and you have a certain amount of, gold reserves on hand and cash deposits on hand. You want to, earn interest on that as well. And so what they would do is they would take that gold, or take that physical U.S. dollar cash, and deposit in the bank of a major city, so like Philadelphia. The problem was those banks started to become central spokes of the system, where now you have a reserve city bank that has the deposits of other banks. And so if enough of their what are called correspondent banks fail, these smaller rural banks, now that bigger bank will be in trouble, because they'll have all these deposits that they are holding for their client banks pulled out of their vaults, right, because of bankruptcy. And so that creates this contagion effect, where a bank run would not only affect a small bank in a rural city, it would start to kind of balloon out into bigger and bigger cities, and it would move to Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, and the major money centers that provided finance for post Civil War America. And in 1907, this came to a head, where there was a trust company called Knickerbocker Trust, which was you could kind of think of it as like a shadow bank. Basically, this entity was, pooling deposits and lending them out in the form of stock loans to speculators. And two of those speculators, Franz Heinz and I'm forgetting the second guy's name, but they were speculating on the shares of a copper mining company. And that copper mining company, the price raced up. They thought they could corner the market, and then finally it collapsed, and they got called on their margin loans. This Knickerbocker Trust, which was a shadow bank, which only had 5% of their deposits secured, went under. And again, this trust had liabilities with all these major banks. All these major banks start to get called on. The bank run starts to move throughout New York City. And before you know it, by late October of 1907, the entire banking system of New York City is collapsing. And JP Morgan is able to basically strong arm the leaders of the major banks to put up their own personal capital to recapitalize the New York Stock Exchange itself, as well as some of these banks, and basically let some of these trust companies die, because the trust companies obviously were much more levered because they only had 5%, deposits, or you could call it like gold to deposit ratio, versus the banks, which had around 20%. So they had to let this system kind of implode in some form and take some losses, but they were able, luckily, to save the system in its majority. And then the question became, what happens if we don't have a JP Morgan around to organize a quasi bailout, private bailout of the banking system? And so immediately they started funding. There's the National Monetary Committee that was already funded by Congress that was doing research into what the existence of a central bank would look like in the U.S. And Paul Warburg actually was a German banker who came over, and he was actually initially writing papers for the National Monetary Commission and putting out research showing this is why we need a central bank. This is how this system will implode without it. And again, instead of thinking of how do we stop this fractional reserve banking system or how do we solve these fundamental problems, their goal is to paper it over and to create even more centralization and more control. And so, by the time we get to 1910, there's enough momentum to push, the first attempt of an act through Congress. The issue was that, Democrats in the House, along with Teddy Roosevelt, were very antitrust and anti-banker, and so they opposed the Federal Reserve Act, and it was actually called, I think, the National Reserve Act, with the first attempt. And so they shot that down, and then after they shot that down, the bankers had to reconvene and kind of reassess the situation and try again and change. They changed a few key things, like changing the name to Federal Reserve to make it sound more in control of the government. They changed the governor and the chairman so that they would be appointed by the executive branch. And they also made some changes to how the appointments and dismissal of different officers would go, and they wanted to make this seem like it's a government entity, where in reality it was really a creation of the bankers and for the bankers, right? 9 out of 12 of every board of governors in Federal Reserve banks across the nation had to be appointed or recommended by the banking industry itself. So they were guaranteed a permanent majority on every, board of governors on every Federal Reserve Bank district. And even the existence of the districts was another attempt at feigning decentralization, because they were trying to show, look, this isn't a single central bank, it's 12 central banks that are all decentralized, and each one has an independent board of governors, and they're all going to independently issue money, and they're all going to independently set interest rates. But as you can imagine, once you have this structure in place, it's pretty easy to create a new, charter that says, oh, well, actually, all the banks will coordinate interest rates, and all the banks will follow the New York Fed or follow the Washington, D.C. Fed, a board of governors. And so, once they passed this, it was kind of like a Trojan horse. And I think, Julian mentioned this earlier, but the naming of it, right? Having this happen on Jekyll Island it's just so perfect, because Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the story about this doctor who turns into a monster at night and then turns back into a human, and slowly he starts to turn more and more into a monster, and he cannot control it, which is essentially what the Fed has become. It's more and more of a monster in financial markets and has distorted price mechanisms across the board.
As you were talking about the kind of decentralized and name only nature of the Fed, we've got all these all these member banks. It's okay. It's totally decentralized. It just reminds me of shitcoins too, where it's
literally
it's totally decentralized.
It's proof of stake.
Yeah, it's so absurd too, and I mean, again, great marketing on their part, on the creators of the Federal Reserve, to call it federal. That's the brilliant part. It's like, oh well, it's the Federal Reserve, of course. Then it must be fine. It's just the government, right? And it's like, well, no, it's kind of a cartel of private bankers. But Julie, I'm not sure if there's anything you wanted to add to that kind of that lead up there before I dig into a little bit of the meeting itself, because I do want to talk about the fact that they had this meeting in secrecy, and that should tell you so much. But is there anything else you want to toss on top of that first?
No, that was a perfect backdrop to it. The documentary touches upon what I find really interesting is that central banking was something that the American public was very aware of throughout I believe, the 19th century. So in the 1800s, like, I gotta get my presidents right. I'm a Canadian, so excuse me for this, but it was Andrew Jackson was one of the biggest opponents to central banking, and he fought like tooth and nail to keep them out of the United States. And there were attempts throughout the 1800s to do this, but they had limited charters. So there were a couple central banks in the United States that would only, they had these timelines where they would only be there for 20 years and then they'd be shut down. And they kept these things on guardrails because I think they saw what happened in Europe, and they saw the impact of the Rothschilds and the endless wars there that were happening as a result of the banking decisions made. And the American public really did not want central banking. So again, like, we discussed, it had to be, the only way it was going to come to America was, one, by taking advantage of a crisis, and by two, but kind of passing it under the shade of night.
Yeah, I mean, if you actually look into the story, right, like all the bankers, Paul Warburg, J.P. Morgan, they got on a train in New Jersey, and they all gave fake names. And the name of the car, which, in olden times, wealthy people would have their own train cars and would usually name it after their own last name or a relative. They changed the name of the car so even the servants wouldn't realize that this was J.P. Morgan and Paul Warburg, other industrialists that were coming at night, literally sneaking away to Jekyll Island. And Jekyll Island itself is a very, reclusive place. It's almost like a, golf slash like, fishing resort for wealthy people on this island. It's not very well populated. It's almost like an exclusive country club, and it's hard to get there. I mean, now there's a bridge, but in the past you had to take boats.
It's a moment in the doc, and I don't want to give too much away because people should watch it. But basically, we're talking about like islands are a great place to get away with stuff. Like it's like what happens on the island stays on the island. But I find it to be so ridiculous that this plan was literally hatched in secret. Nobody that is there is any sort of elected representative of the people, right? Or correct me if I'm wrong, but nobody who was attending that initial meeting was in any way an elected representative at that point? Or
there was one Senator, Nelson Aldrich, which was...
Yeah.
Okay, Aldrich. Yep. Okay. So you did have one representative of the people clearly doing exactly what the people wanted, right? But, okay, so they're on Jekyll Island, and they are doing it there in secret. They're like... Basically, how do they go from that? I mean, I know they renamed it, to the Federal Reserve, right? And they did all these other things, but I mean, do you think that they actually had any decent motivations out of this? Was there any part of this that actually they thought, well, maybe this will benefit the people. We will increase stability. We will, or do you think this is truly just a play for control, a play for power, a play for centralization, which J.P. Morgan obviously already had wanted to do?
That's kind of like the biggest question that I've had, and it's kind of impossible to know. There's some evidence that this decision was made out of kind of like a malevolence and like self-interest and not done selflessly. But there's 7 different participants, and there's varying levels to which we can kind of like guess who came up with what idea here. But I'll pass to you, Peruvian. Like, what do you think about it? Because I don't think that they could have seen what this would become, but I think there was obviously an insight that this would become an increasingly larger part of the fiscal decision making, that power would like gradually accrue to this Federal Reserve over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think again, I think even the most benevolent and kind-hearted spirits of the meeting knew that this would centralize the banking system. And I mean, it's even written into the Federal Reserve Act itself. There's a stipulation that once they created the Federal Reserve, right, so once they created these 12 district banks, which, by the way, they haven't updated the banks since 1913. That's why there's only, one bank on the West Coast in San Francisco, and most of them are centered in the eastern or Midwestern U.S. there's a stipulation that all the banks in the region were required by law to buy into the share capital of the local Federal Reserve Bank. So it was not an optional system. That's another thing that people misunderstand. They think, the Federal Reserve was like this alternative system that banks could use as a lender of last resort. They could put their reserves there, right? They could earn interest on their reserves, and then, if ever they needed a bailout, they could ask for a short-term loan, and again, the loan would be paid back in time. So it wasn't an issue of actually a permanent bailout for the banks. It was just a temporary solvency or liquidity, facility. But what it really was a forced mandate for all the private banks to buy into this local Fed bank, and then they were obviously granted a 6% dividend on the bank's shares, so that they would profit from it. So they would have a vested interest in continuing to perpetuate this system, and they also had the ability, obviously, to appoint governors to their local Federal Reserve Bank. And so I think, it's very hard to make the case that this wasn't structured in a way that made it into that wasn't, they weren't thinking of a centralization of control and power of the banking system. Now, could they have thought that this was overall beneficial? They thought, hey, look, I'm going to profit from this, but this is also better for the system as a whole. I think that they probably did think that, and I don't think that they probably anticipated the size and the just the pure nefariousness of what they created. There's no way they could have anticipated that. But I think to say that they were completely unaware of the centralizing force that this would become is naive. I think they knew that, and I think they wanted that to be a fact because they were worried about the decentralized nature of the banking system itself because of these reserve city banks that already existed. And again, they made this structure, they kind of modeled it after what already existed. So they're trying to they're trying to convince the banks. Like if you read some of the transcripts of Paul Warburg's discussions at the National Monetary Committee, or him talking to bankers, in New York or in Philadelphia or in Chicago, he was telling them, he's like, look, these banks, these Federal Reserve banks, are exactly what, it's exactly the same as what already exists. You already are a rural bank, and you already put your reserves in these what you call reserve cities, which are the major money centers, right? Philly, Boston, New York, Chicago, and you already do this. So he's like, why not just do it with the federal government, handshake on your back, and this bank that can print infinite reserves? Why not do that? And so it was a very easy sell for them.
Well, and I mean, obviously the players at this meeting too, being already involved in the financial system, they stood to benefit greatly from this. Is that fair to say?
Massive conflict of interest, yeah.
It just seems a little bit obviously this sounds like a good idea to them. They're going to make ungodly amounts of money because of this new system, right? There was no way for them to lose, essentially, if the Federal Reserve was created. Is that a fair statement? Yeah. No.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I wanted Julian to respond, because I don't want to take
I
all
have
their
to
time.
think about that a little bit more. But what's the result? We're still talking about J.P. Morgan today. It's the biggest bank in America, and he had a hand in crafting that. So,
and thank goodness they exist. Otherwise, how would Jeffrey Epstein have been banked?
Exactly.
I'm so glad that J.P. Morgan still exists as a bank, so that they can bank people like Epstein. Just truly impressive. The best part about Bitcoin is that you don't need bankers or central bankers. Bitcoin allows you to be your own bank when you hold your own keys. And the best way to do that is to go to bitbox.swiss/Walker and use the promo code Walker for 5% off the fully open source, easy to use Bitcoin only BitBox02 hardware wallet. Then get your Bitcoin off the exchange and into your own self-custody. We all know Bitcoin is ripping, and soon your stack will be worth a heck of a lot more in fiat value than it is today. So now is the perfect time to make sure you have your security locked down tight for the long haul with Bitbox. Plus, and I cannot emphasize this enough, but the BitBox02 is just easy as hell to use. Whether you're brand new to Bitcoin and it's your first time setting up a hardware wallet, so you're a little bit nervous, or you are a well-seasoned psychopath. Again, it's Bitcoin only, and it's fully open source. Head to their GitHub and verify that for yourself. No need to trust me or Bitbox. When you go to bitbox.swiss/Walker and use promo code Walker, Not only do you get 5% off a great piece of open source Bitcoin only hardware, but you also help support this podcast. So thank you. But okay, and boy, there's like a whole nother rabbit hole that maybe we can go down a little bit later about JP Morgan and some events leading up to this meeting and certain large ships crashing. I don't want to derail us with anything like that just yet, but maybe that's something we get into a little bit later. But there's that quote. I think it's like Stafford Beer or but it's the purpose of a system is what it does, right? It's like a general heuristic for systems thinking, and it's like if you look at what the Federal Reserve does, what the result is. Some of the things you mentioned earlier, Peruvian, whether it be decreasing purchasing power through inflation, increasing wealth gaps, massive forever wars, all of these negative externalities, all these downstream effects, like that's what the system does. Thereby, that is the purpose of this system. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about kind of in the years following the creation of the Federal Reserve, some of the historically significant events that happen. Obviously, you have World War I, and then, another decade and a half down the line, you have the Great Depression, which people like to think just kind of like came out of nowhere. And like it was just because of all these speculators. But it's like, well, why were all these people speculating? Why was there so much liquidity floating around? And then around that same time, I think it was 1927, you had the McFadden Act, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the act that actually granted the Federal Reserve a charter in perpetuity. But can we talk a little bit about those post-1913 years and kind of what was the result of the Fed's creation in terms of like what actually happened in the world? What hand did the Fed have in it?
Yeah, I think World War I is probably a good place to start with all this, because that was like pretty soon after, around the time that the Federal Reserve was established. And again, like to me, the evidence is pretty clear that the length and the magnitude of that war was enabled by central banking. Just the sheer amount of like debt and role that not only like the Federal Reserve played in that, but the European central banks and the interaction between the Central Bank of America, the Federal Reserve, and the European central banks, cross-collateralizing, leaning on each other for resources, and the U.S. dollar the U.S. dollar was not a standard. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe it was like a very standard unit of account before the Fed. Like there was a U.S. dollar, but like there were all sorts of different Commonwealth, dollars around the U.S. They made it one solid thing across the country after the Federal Reserve. It says on the bottom of each note, Federal Reserve note. After World War I, that note started to expand outside American borders, basically. The Fed enabled the U.S. dollar essentially to travel outside of the U.S. in a way that I don't think it could have before that.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about this story is that there was obviously central banks in Europe even before the existence of the Fed, and there was a massive pressure from European bankers for the Fed itself to exist. And then once the Fed did exist, there was much more openness from these bankers to extend credit and to do business with American banks. And again, they hide under the auspices of of banking security. They say, well, we only want to do business with a nation that had a central bank, and so we know that any bank we do business with can be bailed out, and so our contracts are more secure. But if you look at the actual history of central banking, you've seen almost a retaliatory nature when it comes to central bankers or banking in general to nations that do not have central banks. In 1836, I believe, or 1837, Andrew Jackson failed to renew the charter for the Second National Bank of the U.S., which was, again, our second central bank. And, that bank was much different from the Fed in that it was not, did not have this large decentralized system. It did not force people to buy in, and it also was barred from buying government bonds, at least initially. And even though, that was the case, it was a very limited central bank. When Andrew Jackson decided not to renew the charter and veto the Senate vote to renew it, bankers in England and France stopped providing credit to the United States, and so that caused a banking panic, and deep recession immediately for several years after he decided to do this. And again, they put out propaganda leaflets in the U.S. saying, hey, look, you're in a recession. That's because of Andrew Jackson, and that's because he didn't let you guys have a central bank. Whereas they were knowingly and willingly deciding not to extend credit. So that pressure has existed for a long time. And, that I agree, like a great place to start is World War I, where, you have the major nations of Europe enter into this war where it very quickly turns into a stalemate and it becomes a battle of attrition. It just becomes, how many men, how much equipment, supplies, dollars can you just throw into this, meat grinder and see who comes out the other side. And so, the existence of any nation, like the existence of any nation on a gold standard would prevent that. And so that's why Britain, France, Germany, all the major nations involved had to go off a gold standard very quickly. And when they tried to go back on the gold standard in post World War I era, they all did it in different ways. Germany just decided to hyperinflate because their liabilities were way too great. France posted it was like a par value that was 20% above where the value was, and so they experienced massive inflation. After 4 years of 30% inflation, they did another 20% inflation. And Britain decided to try to go back at the pre-war parity of gold to pounds. And that was not tenable because now you have 4 times the amount of pounds in existence as before, and you're trying to peg back to the pre-war parity. And so Britain experienced a Great Depression even before the U.S. did. But what really happened is, as you see through this process, is that the Fed was able to, and central banks in general were able to slowly, incrementally increase their power, increase their influence, and increase their centralization. If you go to the Great Depression, for example, it's really easy. The Fed's district banks were all independent in the sense that they all issued their own notes. So, like, if you actually went to the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, in that region, you would actually get a Federal Reserve note, a bank note, that wouldn't say Federal Reserve, it would say Federal Reserve of San Francisco. And so it was like a note that was valid in your district. And so that was part of the decentralization. And in 1933, with the Great Depression, they centralized all of that into the single Federal Reserve. And they also centralized control of all the interest rates because, again, all these banks supposedly, at least most of the time, were able to set their own interest rates. And so you could have a 5% interest rate in San Francisco and a 7% interest rate in Chicago. But with these further acts that amended their charter, they changed this to become a single interest rate set by the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., and just continually centralizing on a system that was already being centralized even before they existed.
Well, and to me, the sad irony of so much of this stuff, like you look at the Great Depression and it's like, this horrible thing happened because of the animal spirits of the market. Like we don't know how people were speculating too much, I guess, all these animal spirits flying around. We should probably have more control. And by the way, we need our charter to never expire. We need that charter to be guaranteed in perpetuity, which it was after that. I don't remember if it was maybe Peruvian, if it was the McFadden Act in 27 or the one of the acts that came out in 1933 that guaranteed the charter in perpetuity. Do you know which one it was?
I think it was the McFadden Act. I'd have to go back and read
that feels right. But either way, it's like you're using these crises that presumably come out of nowhere. Like, who knows why the market got so frothy? But it's like, well, no, you're literally the ones controlling the money. You're the ones that are setting these interest rates. You're the ones deciding how much to print. The market goes through these boom and bust cycles because they're orchestrated by your monetary policy. And then the only antidote to that, there's never any sort of reflection to say, you know what, maybe we actually don't have this whole market thing figured out too well. They're just like, nope, we should probably just have more power. Like that's the obvious solution to this. Like it's just kind of mind blowing. Like I don't know.
Yeah,
and I
it
didn't
is.
even have a question there. I was just sometimes I'm just dumbfounded by it.
You're right. And actually, so one of my early pieces, again, I'm like a macro econ writer, and one of my early pieces that went really viral on Twitter was when I called the financial gravity and the Fed's dilemma. and I kind of like juxtapose the existence of the Fed and their lowering and raising of interest rates to financial gravity. And I was saying, look, despite the traditional orthodoxy that believes that the Fed is preventing the business cycle from overheating, right? What their goal was, they've known that for centuries the business cycle has existed because the business cycle is just human. It's just human psychology, right? People start to get together, they start to buy a bunch of houses, the house prices start to go up, then they start to speculate, and then the house prices rise too high, and then there's too much debt, and then it starts to roll over, and then you have a recession. And so recessions were commonplace. I mean, you can trace them from in every developed economy for the last 500 years. Every 8 years there's a mild recession, and that's just kind of how this system works. The problem that the Fed had was they had the arrogance of believing that they could kill that business cycle. They believed that they could quash it. And what they would do is they would lower rates into a recession, and then they'd, increase rates, into a boom so that they would stop the economy from quote unquote overheating. And their goal, which was, pounded into my head when I took economics courses at university, was, they had this line of GDP potential. And instead of having us go up and down and have a boom and then have a bust and have a boom and have a bust. And again, these recessions were normal. They've happened for thousands of years. Yes, it's painful for a few years, 18 months, but usually it works itself out. The leverage cleans itself out of the system. They wanted to just have it be a straight upwards line. So they're like, we want to quash this business cycle. And so the perfect example is the 1920s, right? They lowered the call loan interest rate to 2%. And they keep it there for like 5 years, and they don't start raising until like 1927. And by the time they start raising, it's way too late because the economy of the U.S. is overheated by every single metric. There are people gambling their, life savings on radio companies and General Electric and car companies, and there's, 130% margin loans on some of these stocks. Like it's insane, and they're 1920s is exactly like a predecessor to the 1980s, almost like what's that movie with Jordan Belfort, Wolf of Wall Street, where it's just mania, right? People calling grandmas, and the existence of the radio. There were radio programs going on saying you need to buy General Electric, you need to buy Ford. It's gone up 30% this year. It's going to go up another 50%. You need to buy. And we got to this, insane bubble territory by 1928, 1929, and the Fed started hiking and blindly hiking into a recession, and then this whole, house of cards collapsed. And so once that happens, of course, then they blame the market for this reaction. It's never their fault. And then if they lower rates into the recession, the irony is that they don't actually allow these bad debts to clear themselves out, right? They don't allow the entities that should go bankrupt. They never do. And so that bad debt just accumulates. And so with this cycle of lowering interest rates into a recession and increasing them into a boom, they just keep allowing more and more bad debt to accumulate until we get to the point where we're at 80% private debt to GDP and 130% public debt to GDP in the U.S. And there's so much debt that the system starts to fall apart every time we hike. And that's where the Fed has to cut. We have a Fed meeting today. They're cutting again. They just cut 25 basis points. Why? We're not in a recession. There's no banking panic that they're talking about. We're lowering because the system cannot handle this, right? The Treasury itself is straining. And so it's just their game. And the problem is that this game is terminal because it eventually means that the system is so indebted that nothing can save it except for QE infinity.
You made me aware of something really interesting because back in the 20s, there's actually a really good parable between the studio system and how Hollywood used to package movies and how CDOs kind of worked pre-2008. So I don't know if people are privy to like the old Hollywood studio way of doing things, but essentially when you wanted to contract out a new deal of movies, you'd kind of have like your headliner movie, and then you'd package it with a bunch of like other crappy, B, C, D films. And I was thinking like the other day, I remember, I forget it was called like Metropolis or something. There was there's a massive studio flick that back in the 1920s cost $40 million back then to create, which is almost something like $1 billion today. That like was a massive financial flop. So the studio industry, I don't know how big of a factor it was compared to the the subprime industry, but it's the same antics were going on back then with like priming the pump, easy credit. The studio systems were bundling like B and C grade call it debt productions in with like A grade debt. And yeah, it's just there's so many interesting parables in history there. But the Fed's always a part of all that stuff.
Well, I mean, just talking about like the history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And like in the case of the Fed, it seems to rhyme very closely. Like as you just said, Peruvian, I was just searching on the side and I saw that the Fed just cut again. And what you just described happening in the leading up to the Great Depression is literally like what we've seen here today. It's like, okay, they overheated the economy, that inflation started going wild during COVID, right? I mean, who could have seen that coming with all of the monetary debasement that was happening? It's truly shocking. And then it got hotter and hotter and hotter. And then they were like, oh, you know what? Jerome Powell went from, we're not even thinking about raising rates, to the fastest rate hike in history. Mm-hmm. And now, after the fastest hike, they're now just cutting them again. And it's like we never learn, apparently. I mean, at least there's more information accessible now, but it's like we're just doing it again.
And you know what you get? You know what you get at the end of that? After they destroy countless amounts of lives, countless amounts of businesses, all you get, the one concession you and I get, is you get, whoops, sorry. It's the same phrase. Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, one day it'll be Jerome Powell. Whoops, we miscalculated. Sorry, guys. Move on, I guess. Right? Well, guess what? We are finally fucking moving on, and it's called Bitcoin, and we're not going to take this shit anymore for the next, like, few decades, or ever, hopefully, anymore after this. So, yeah.
Hey, I want to get into Bitcoin a little bit as well here, because I think all three of us might be kind of interested in Bitcoin, if I had to guess.
Just a little bit.
But
just a little bit.
But I
can't tell.
No idea. You're keeping a very low profile. But I did want to talk a little bit about just kind of like these downstream effects of the Fed, because I think for a lot of people, like the average person who's just trying to go through their day, who's trying to put food on the table and keep a roof over the head of their family, and is just making it just trying to get by, they're not reading The Creature from Jekyll Island, right? Hopefully they'll watch your film because it's short and approachable and high density entertainment, or I should say edutainment. And so I encourage anyone who ends up listening to this to please go and watch that when it comes out. But like, I don't think people realize the actual extent of the damage that the Fed has caused. And they have a dual mandate, right? It's maximum employment and price stability. And if you just look at that, like, they've just been a colossal failure, first of all, just right on that dual mandate. But it goes so much deeper than that. And I mean, maybe we can just talk a little bit about like, what do you think people need to understand about the damage that the Fed has done, and why, and that it's not some nebulous thing, that it's actually something that affects them. It affects them in their daily lives. It affects their futures and their children. It'll affect their grandchildren too, unless we end the Fed before that. But like, what do you want people to understand, and maybe what do you want people to understand from this film as well?
I'll try and get my bit done quickly, but essentially when you have a monetary system that has no limits on how much can be printed, the only way to really establish long-term security for yourself and other generations is to just hoard as many assets as possible, as many real assets, whether they're cash flow producing or whether they have like, just good speculative value, just accrue as many of them as possible. So they set up a world where greed is the only way to essentially make it. You have to be greedy. You can't be selfless, because if you're selfless, you're going to be poor. And so what they turn money into a drug, essentially, that you have to acquire at all costs. And there's never too much of it. You have to keep accumulating more, because if you sit, once you're satisfied with your, couple million cash, guess what? After a couple of years, your purchasing power is eradicated. So it sets up this world, and Ian says it beautifully in the film, it sets up this world where you're paid to sin. And those are the downstream effects. It's the OnlyFans, it's the crypto, get-rich-quick scams, it's the hoarding of real estate, it's the hoarding of assets. It's all of these things. It sets up this world where you're paid to sin, and that destroys society, that destroys cultural cohesion, that destroys, like, you know, morality, the fabric of families. Like, we can't even fathom all the downstream effects. But eventually, if you look, it all just kind of just ties back to that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's really complex, right, to unpack all of it. And you know, the first place, whenever we talk about the Federal Reserve printing, right, my fellow macro enthusiasts on Twitter always have confronted me in spaces, and they've said, "Peruvian, you're an idiot. The Fed doesn't print money. You know, have you not looked into the actual, you know, structure of the Fed?" And I say, yes. And actually, they, you know, to say that they don't print money is it's like an oxymoron. It's true and it's not true. And I'm like, yeah, they print reserves. And it's actually more nefarious in some ways than even just printing money outright. And the reason why is because bank reserves exist only in the financial system. And so when the Fed does QE and they create bank reserves and they swap them for assets on commercial bank balance sheets, they're increasing the size of the overall financial system because they're creating, right, assets out of nothing and swapping them for other assets and growing the overall size of the balance sheets of the banking system. And that means that there's more capacity to lend, there's more capacity to speculate, and risk assets start to rally. So the Fed does QE, you know, like, for example, we saw this in 2008 perfectly, right? The banking system's falling apart. Stock markets are in free fall. They bottom by, you know, March of 2009, and as the Fed begins their first QE program, $600 billion, markets start to rally. And then 2010, comes around. It's not enough. The market starts to stagnate again. They announce QE2. And then they grow the balance sheet to $4 trillion. And then they realize they try to taper the balance sheet. It doesn't work. They have to do QE3 and then QE infinity, which is, you know, COVID. And so at every juncture, they're forced to create more and more reserves. And these reserves flowed into commercial bank balance sheets, which flowed into hedge funds, you know, money market funds, mutual funds, pension funds. All of these institutions get this cash. They're barred, obviously, from actually using this cash. Functionally, you cannot use it to buy real-world goods that we think of, like, you know, Beanie Babies or Big Macs. You have to use it to speculate on financial assets, you know. And so these institutions go out and they buy the S&P 500. They go out and buy bonds. They go out and buy stocks. They go out and buy even crypto. And so you see this proliferation of, you know, risk-taking all throughout the system. And the reason why this is problematic is because, you know, every single system in existence, almost every single system in existence follows what's called a Pareto distribution. So mathematically, the square root of the sum of the total has around 50% of, you know, the supply of goods or services. So if you think about, like, you know, Spotify, the top 100 artists on Spotify make 90% of the money. If you think about the size of stars in the universe, like, you know, the the amount of paintings made by people, the amount of you know, money made on YouTube by YouTubers, it's all Pareto distribution. So it's naturally, the system's naturally unequal. That's how the universe works. The problem with what the Fed does is it exacerbates that to a level that was never seen before, right? They take these assets. There's already people who are wealthy that own, let's say they own $2 million in S&P 500, and the majority of people obviously do not own that. And if you increase the S&P by 20% a year by running QE, you make that person's wealth balloon by $400,000 a year, whereas the person who owns $10,000 of SPY only makes $2,000 a year. So the people who are ahead increasingly get further and further and further ahead. And we live in a system now where the top 10% own 83% of all listed equities. So when the Fed does QE, they're effectively enriching the wealthy. And that just makes, you know, lobbying, bribing, you know, like you said, wars, like big pharma, all these things become easier because now all these already wealthy entities have more wealth to use at their disposal as like a power tool to influence the real world. And it's unfair because they didn't work for this money. They're just getting it for free by just holding assets.
And to add insult to injury, almost all the regulations work in favor of having more. If you have more capital and more collateral, you're allowed to borrow in a way with a higher leverage that poor people just can't, right? Like your local mini mart where you have to take like a payday loan, you're paying 300-400%, but you know, someone can like Elon Musk can pledge Tesla shares at collateral and probably borrow it at basically prime, right? And it's like no other person has access to those things. So again, it's you're totally right. The Pareto principle it just goes ad infinitum because it's just you got the regulations, but then you just got the math behind it that just makes it just so much worse over and over and over.
I think it's always interesting too. Like you see politicians, like let's take our favorite Bitcoin hater, Elizabeth Warren, as an example. And, she's always blaming these, these billionaires and these greedy corporations for prices going up and for all these things. And it's like, there's no acknowledgement that, I'm not saying that those things, that they don't happen, right? That there's not, as you said, like, people, if you have a lot of money, more money accrues to you because of this fiat system. The Cantillon effect, or Cantillon, depending on if you want to take his Irish or French ancestry for his name. The closer you are to the money creation, the more benefit you derive from it. But the point is that it's still always, all of those things are downstream. The billionaires and the greedy corporations are downstream of the money creation itself. Whenever you hear politicians, not all, Thomas Massey, for example, actually talks about the Fed. I mean, Ron Paul has been talking about the Fed for decades. But most politicians don't actually address the giant freaking elephant in the room, which is, we have a central bank that prints money, creates reserves, however you want to say it, out of thin air. And that is what creates these massive and ever-widening distortions that most negatively impact the poorest and most vulnerable in the society, while enriching anybody who owns assets. And the people who own assets, well, they are the wealthiest in the society. And if you own a lot of them, you're definitely the wealthiest. Like, it's just crazy. It's like all of the political solutions that are put forward seem to be like trying to put a Band-Aid on an axe wound. Like, that's okay, that's nice, but like, I don't know if you noticed, you still have a giant gaping axe wound in your leg. Like, that Band-Aid's not doing anything. Like, you need to close that wound. And that, again, that's where it like comes back to Bitcoin. It's like, maybe there's not a solution from the inside. Maybe because this system is so entrenched, so broken. Like, I'm curious what you guys think, if there is any possibility of reforming this system, this Federal Reserve fiat system, from the inside out, or if that can only happen by external forces, parallel systems, being a forcing function for change from the outside, if that makes sense.
Julian, do you want to add anything, or I can go for it?
You can go for it. I have to think on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, this is something I've been thinking about, been writing about for the last 2 or 3 years, and the conclusion I came to is actually really simple, right? Like, the existence of the fiat system demands that interest be paid, and the reason why is because debt is money, right? Whenever their new currency units are created, they're loaned into existence. And, to complete the loop on that prior thought of, is the Fed printing money? Technically, right? I said it's an oxymoron. They are and they aren't. Yes, they're printing reserves. The irony is that those reserves, again, they flow out into the banking system. And if they're loaned into the real economy, they become real cash. The other way they become real cash, and we think real cash like M2, is if the government spends money. So the government, the Treasury, they sell bonds. Who do they sell bonds to? Pension funds, banks, hedge funds, right? Primary dealers. That money goes into their Treasury General account, which is their checking account, and then they spend it into the real economy. There's like a magic button they press that turns bank reserves into M2 cash. And so that's why you see the chart of M2 just go exponential with COVID, because the government had this huge stimulus of trillions of dollars of money flowing to the real economy. And that's the missing link that I think Peter Schiff, all the gold bug Austrian libertarians missed is, they were decrying hyperinflation in 2011. It never came because we didn't have the fiscal spending to pair with the QE. Once you have fiscal spending, once you have a government that's so indebted that they're just only spending their way out, you have this release valve from the financial system that moves down into the real economy, where all these reserves that are created up in the financial economy, right, in the markets, by the central bank, that are flowing around on bank balance sheets, they're all now starting to channel down into the real economy and turn into real money, M2 cash. And that just causes this explosion of cash. And because money demands an interest rate, that means every year, if you think about a simple system, if there's $100 and there's 5% interest rate, $105 needs to be paid back next year, no matter what. And so where do those marginal $5 come from? You have to create them. And so that means that if you base a monetary system on debt, you have to continually increase the money supply, no matter what. And, the only way to like prevent that would be to have almost like a military rule where you would tell the banks 0% rates. You cannot make usury is essentially illegal and punishable by death. But the issue with that, again, is, okay, so people are really pissed off about the monetary system. That works for a generation or two. And then the people forget about the evils of central banking and of interest and usury. And they say, hey, the banks are like, please, come on, we need to make some profits. If we make profits, we can more intelligently invest in the market. And so people say, okay, well, 2%, let's let the banks loan again, and then let's let them loan at 5 and 7, and then the problem starts all over again, where now these banks need to lend more money. The central bank needs to help finance that. The central bank is able to manipulate rates to allow them to lend as much as they want, and the system is just perpetuates. And so I've come to the conclusion that there is no way to fix it within the system, because it's humans and human incentives and human desires that ultimately shape the system. That's why Bitcoin is so brilliant, is because it removes humans from the monetary system for the first time in all history.
Yeah, and I think there's this really interesting conversation going on right now in the States about a Bitcoin reserve and sort of like what the whole point of it is. Is it a system that eventually, if that reserve grows big enough, could we just, press delete on the fiat system because it just kind of like removes all the liabilities out of the U.S., economy? Like, let's just say we buy $1 trillion of Bitcoin and Bitcoin does, a Bitcoin thing and goes up 100x, right? It's like, wow, now all of a sudden the assets are maybe worth as much as the liabilities. And now we're at a crossroads where maybe we can like make a decision about, how we're going to redirect and conduct Fed policy. I don't know, like it just feels so early on that. I personally hold out hope that there will be parallel systems, and I think the thing I'm a little surprised by, honestly, and maybe I'm just like my expectations, I'm not being patient enough, is I thought after El Salvador adopted it, more people would get it as like we should start storing this as a reserve, and I think a lot of people are, but I think maybe the logical thing right now is they're all trying to do it in secret as much as possible before they're kind of like out in the open about it, because I think it's like it's the game theory thing. It's like once the firing shot is off and it's clear to the world, then it's just a rush into this asset. And so everyone's trying to they're just waiting and hoping no one, peeps too loud about it. But yeah, I don't ultimately believe that like the fiat system can reform itself. I think there's like there's the level of like incentives that I just don't think will ever be perfectly aligned from bankers and the government and the people. I think it's just a very, maybe overly optimistic view of things to expect that to happen. But I don't know. I could be wrong on that.
Peruvian, I'm curious what you think about the Bitcoin strategic reserve idea as well, just because Julian brought it up. Like, do you think this is something that, it seems more and more likely that this is going to happen according to source. But where are you at with this? How are you thinking about this? Good thing, bad thing, saves fiat, ends fiat? What happens?
Sure. Actually, this is a really good... I was about to jump in with what Julian just said because it's a really good point, and I've actually written about it in my Dollar Endgame series, extensively. The issue with Bitcoin being adopted as a strategic reserve, right, is that it's coming for the king daddy of all fiat currencies, which is the U.S. dollar. The dollar is the global reserve currency. It's loaned, in 170 out of 180 or so nations, and it's used for cross-border payments globally. And, if we're talking about 62% of global Forex reserves denominated in dollars, 53% of all transactions, 83% of all cross-border transactions, something like 80 to 90% of all banks globally have access to the U.S. SWIFT system. So this is like the king daddy. It's like the underpinning of the entire global financial system. You could kind of think of the fiat system as the dollar and then derivatives of the dollar, which are all developed economy currencies, and then below that, all emerging market currencies. And so, the Fed, this is, on the back of Brent Johnson's milkshake theory, which is a really good, he's a really good macro pundit and commentator, which is that the Fed essentially controls the price of money globally, not because all currencies have to use the U.S. dollar to transact trade. And so when the Fed changes interest rates, or when the Fed moves, monetary policy, it affects every single nation, right? And right now is a perfect example. You see the Korean won, you see the Japanese yen, you see the Canadian dollar at historic lows against the U.S. dollar, and it's because of this, hiking cycle that they've done that's been so fast, that's put the domestic U.S. interest rate above the rest. And El Salvador adopting Bitcoin as a strategic reserve, as a treasury asset, I think it doesn't have, a hundredth of the importance of the U.S. government doing that. And again, it's because the U.S. government actually controls the global reserve currency. And with the central underpinning of the entire global monetary system beginning to adopt Bitcoin, that is what finally puts a target on other central bank backs. Bitcoin, I think it's going to follow the same, it's a new money, so it's going to be difficult. It's very difficult to map out exactly how this plays out. But I agree with the thesis that, it goes through the 3 stages of money. It goes through store of value, then medium of exchange, and then unit of account. And we're still in the store of value stage, right? We're still convincing people, hey, this is a superior, capital preservation mechanism. It's going to be much more difficult to convince people to actually adopt it as a medium of exchange and a unit of account until the fiat system begins to truly enter its terminal stages, which again, I believe it's coming in the next 10 to 15 years. But as if the U.S. government can do this, I think that this really sends a signal out to other central banks, because no longer do they need to hold U.S. treasuries. They can just hold Bitcoin. And as the U.S. acquires more Bitcoin, their values will increase. And as other nation states join in, it's almost like a game theory mechanism where everyone starts to rush, right? Every single, if you're Singapore, if you're Australia, if you're Norway, you're just like, wait. The global reserve currency, which is the global empire, the hegemon, is acquiring Bitcoin at 400,000 Bitcoin a year. I'm going to start, what am I doing? Like, I need to get in this immediately. I'm holding U.S. treasuries. Why do I even own those that make 5%? Why not sell the U.S. treasuries, only hold liquid U.S. dollars, and only hold Bitcoin? And I think that's a much more consequence. And so I'm hopeful that that happens. But even if it doesn't, right, this is inevitable no matter what. It's just a question of timing. This would speed things up. If they don't do it, it would slow things down. But eventually, again, all fiats must die, because this, the system's unsustainable just by design.
Well, I want to pull on that a little bit, because you mentioned in the next 10 to 15 years, you think fiat enters kind of a terminal stage. So just to clarify, do you think that nations, like if we look at just like the G7s, or let's look at the nations that are printing their own currency and that are have they're the largest, richest nations, right? Do those nations adopting a Bitcoin strategic reserve, does it prolong the life of their own fiat? Like, if the U.S. does this first, is the dollar the last fiat domino to fall? I mean, I think it's kind of positioned to be the last domino to fall anyway, even without that, if all else being equal. But how do you see that? Does that accelerate fiat demise? And do you think we reach a state where actually fiat currencies are a thing of the past? Because I struggle with that, and I often think it's like, well, fiat currencies could be useful tools for governments still, even on a Bitcoin standard. They may want to still use them. They would just be different from the fiat we know today. There'd be more accountability to that fiat. So how do you see that playing out?
Sure. The only way, right, the only way that they would really work to save their domestic currencies is if they pegged their fiat to Bitcoin and allowed redemptions and capital flows. A lot of nations actually cannot do that functionally, like China or like Russia. They have closed capital accounts. They cannot allow money to go in and out freely, because they have a currency peg rate that they want to maintain, and it's called the policy trilemma in macroeconomics. You can't have an open capital account, free floating exchange rate, and independent monetary autonomy. So either you're going to give up your monetary autonomy to the Fed, which has become a vassal state of the U.S., or you're going to close your capital account, or you're going to lose your pegged exchange rate. A lot of these countries like Japan don't want to do that. So, if they do want to prolong the existence of their fiat, yes, they can peg it to Bitcoin. I think that would work. But then that would that would kind of bring us back to the Austrian point of, well, great, that's what we wanted. We wanted to rein in, excessive fiscal spending. We wanted to rein in excessive debt, and now you have a limit. Hey, you can't issue. You have 100 sats per yen. You can't issue any more than that. Okay, great. And if you start to, then the people will start redeeming it, and you'll be drained, and then you'll have a bank run just like the old days, and your nation will collapse. And so, I think that, I think that the system. It could have evolved to adapt like mini fiat Bitcoin quasi Bitcoin standards where they peg the rate. My hope is that we eventually make it to a pure Bitcoin standard, and fiats are purely a point of the past. But that's obviously like the most bullish hyper Bitcoinized world. The more maybe middle ground you take is we're going to exist in this world where there are fiat currencies, but they're pegged to Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is the store of value, and all governments are responsible for for redeeming at that parity. And this is actually how the global monetary system worked in the 1800s, 1700s, where everyone was pegged to gold. And whenever a nation would excessively, spend or inflate their currency, you would see an outflow of gold reserves from that nation. So, France fighting the Napoleonic Wars, they got into debt, they started printing money, they started seeing inflation, and gold started to withdraw from France. And it was all drained to the neighboring countries. And then to recover from that, what do they have to do? They have to raise interest rates, rein in monetary spending, actually induce a recession so that their currency strengthens in the forex markets, and then that finally draws the gold back in. And so that was like a self-balancing mechanism that existed during the gold standard, where it would prevent any one nation from issuing too many banknotes because other nations would call in their banknotes and start to just take the gold. And so, the same thing happened to Germany in World War One. And so we could see that same dynamic play out under a Bitcoin standard.
I think probably a pretty cool place where you can maybe picture some of this stuff happening is look at what's going on with Tether and MicroStrategy. These are companies, one of them has, super put Bitcoin as like the lead treasury asset, but Tether is like a really cool parable for what potentially the US dollar could be. Something that initially was backed solely by treasuries, or almost, entirely by treasuries, just like the normal US dollar, but whose Bitcoin reserve has grown and is now eating a bigger slice of what the treasury reserve ratio is within Tether. Now, Tether, if you believe the attestations, is now like it's got a lower LTV ratio because of the increase in the value of Bitcoin in their treasury. They no longer need as many treasuries as I don't know if they're selling them off because of the Bitcoin. I have no clue what's going on there. But tangibly, as Bitcoin's price rises, and as long as they keep it, they could sell off treasuries, right? And so you can use that as maybe a little bit of a microcosm, see what they do as a microcosm for what potentially the U.S. government and other debt-bearing entities could do.
I think Tether probably keeps holding quite a bit of treasuries, though, just so they don't piss off the U.S. government too much. If I had to guess, I'd say that
there's probably
don't worry, guys, we'll keep buying them.
There's some under-the-table deal there for sure. But I think it's interesting, right? Like, we just passed in Vancouver a motion to explore adding Bitcoin to the city's treasury. And one of the arguments that our mayor made is that, we have $3 billion or $3.2 billion of bonds that are only worth $2.8 billion, right? So, we're under collateralized for what we need to pay out. And his argument to adopt Bitcoin is we don't need to put all our money into Bitcoin, but we should have this as sort of like a hedge on these bonds as they're moving inversely to one another. And I just think like you're seeing that shift of thinking in all these smaller institutions work its way up to the bigger mama institution, which is, the federal government and how they treat that asset. So interesting to see all this play out,
Well, it is. That's actually something I wanted to talk with you guys about, because it's like, okay, we've talked about the Fed quite a lot, and there's Peruvian, as you pointed out, we could go for, all day long and still, get close to scratching the surface maybe. But if we look at the state of like Bitcoin adoption, so okay, obviously individual adoption is one thing, retail adoption, as it's commonly called. There's a massive wave of psychopathic hodlers of last resort that continue DCAing all the time, and that's not going to stop. I know my DCA is not going to turn off. Then there's a lot of new entrants that may come in. Okay, but setting aside retail, we look at all the different levels of, let's say, corporate nation state, but also local adoption. Like you mentioned, Vancouver. You look at also in the United States, I think Ohio just put forward a bill. There's other states that have done this as well to establish their own Bitcoin strategic reserves. I know Florida was looking at it, Texas. You're seeing this happen at all these different levels. And it feels to me like there's sort of like something about Bitcoin hitting 100K. Like, even though this is like, it's a number, right? Like, it's a psychological number. Does that number actually like mean anything? I mean, not more than it does in our brains, right? It's just, it is what it is. It's 100,000 US cuck bucks. Like, wow. But something about that seems to have flipped a switch where now we're seeing like the conversations seem to be accelerating. They seem to be getting more serious. It seems to be that everybody is kind of coming around to this realization at the same time that, oh shit, I guess this is real. I guess it's not going to die, at least not, tomorrow. And maybe we need to figure this out like right the fuck now. Are you guys feeling that kind of vibe shift as well?
100%. It is interesting that there's a second order effect of this now where you're seeing unit bias and people are like, screw this Bitcoin thing, I missed it a long time ago. And it's like, I hate to see that discouragement among people who haven't picked it up yet. And I think we have to do our duty as Bitcoiners to tell people, look, sats are a thing, and like it's just because it's already gone from 0 to 100,000, that doesn't mean that it's like near the end of where we think it's going to go and all that. And that all comes with education. I'll say this, I don't have like a ton to say on this, but if you're a creator in this space, it's like the best thing you can do is just stack sats, because that will pay for your ability to educate people more. Like, Bitcoin is your reserve currency to educate other people about Bitcoin. So don't like, I've made some mistakes in selling quite a bit of my Bitcoin to pay for other ventures, and I'm realizing like I probably should have just taken out like fiat debt to pay for my films rather than like sell my Bitcoin to pay for my films. So take that as a bit of experience for me, but like accrue Bitcoin, you can go out and you can educate people so they don't have the unit bias problems. But yeah, in terms of everyone else that's not retail, I think the urgency is really starting to kick in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is where you get into, right, the monetary economics and monetary psychology. And I think, like, I get into arguments all the time. I was in a spaces the other day where people were, Bitcoin skeptics, which is fun. I think that I almost laugh at the Bitcoin skeptics, because especially now with us past 100K, it's like, guys, like this. I was telling you about this at 50K. People were telling me about that 25K. People were before me were talking at 5K, and you still aren't listening. Like, how ignorant do you have to be? But they were saying, they're like, look, it's not used. They're like, Peruvian, you're an idiot. This isn't used as money. This isn't used as a transaction tool. And I'm like, yeah. Do you understand have you heard of Gresham's law? Have you heard that bad money drives out good? If Bitcoiners, we believe it's a store of value, we're not going to go out and just spend. We want it to remain a store of value. We don't want to go out and spend all of our Bitcoin immediately, because we know that the dollar is going to continue to debase. And so because of that incentive structure, it's going to continue to become a store of value and a superior store of value for longer and longer periods of time, until it finally reaches, market cap saturation, where then it will flip into Tier's law, where, we'll start to actually use it as money, because it no longer is going up 20%, or for the 10-year CAGR, 60% a year. Right. So once that train stops, then sure, people want to spend it. But we're still in the store of value stage. We're still convincing people. And every day you see, I think this 100,000 level was very psychological, where, you see the pensions, pension funds in Michigan, you mentioned Florida is looking at it, Texas. I've had several asset managers that I know reach out to me and ask me about Bitcoin custody. And it's funny, because these are people I haven't talked to in like maybe a year or two since the bear market. And now they're just like, hey, Peruvian, do you know a Bitcoin custodian I can talk to? Some of my clients, they keep pestering me about it, And I'm like, well, I have some advice for you, but I also have a little bit of I told you so, because I told you to buy this at 30K and you didn't want to listen.
Okay, couple things I want to pull on there. One, just as a point about the store value, medium of exchange, unit of account progression, right? I think an important caveat to that is like that, that expression, like the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. I think that's the same thing with the progression of Bitcoin as money. I think that like most people do and will go through that kind of standard progression of store value, medium exchange, unit of account. But that doesn't mean that everybody is only at the store of value phase. And depending where you are in the world, or just depending on what you do and where your head is at, like I personally, I think, maybe you guys do too. Like I try to use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange as much as I can. I mean, I certainly use it every day on Nostr, which is great. People are using it right now on this Nostr live stream to zap some sats. I also try to denominate my life in Bitcoin as much as possible, to use it as my personal unit of account, because I find that it's a more accurate one for measuring how much value I'm actually creating and bringing back into myself. The dollar is just a really bad measuring stick, right? Even though it's the prettiest horse at the glue factory, it's still at the glue factory, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that is an interesting point. I do think that a lot of these, like if we go to Lightning, if we go to Fedi, if we go to Nostr kind of indirectly as a way that Bitcoin is used in a very normalized way, I think these are really important things, because that medium of exchange piece is actually really important for, as Jeff Booth would say, Bitcoin remaining decentralized and secure. But I would also concede the point that, like, right now, what do the vast, overwhelming majority of people care about? Is number going to go up? Is value going to be stored? That's just the reality, right? And that's not it's not like it's a bad thing. That's just the reality. It is what it is. And I'm very curious to see too, as we go forward. We've got. I'm curious to see how much Bitcoin the ETFs end up pulling in, because they've obviously been a historic success from an ETF standpoint. It's also like, a lot of Bitcoiners, myself included, I would much rather have actual Bitcoin that I control the keys to than holding an ETF. But okay, for a lot of people, that's an easy way to get exposure. And I'm curious if you think, okay, between nation states setting up Bitcoin strategic reserves potentially, and that kind of snowballing and accelerating, between ETFs gobbling up ever more Bitcoin, do you think there are any risks to that as we go down the line, in terms of this is a centralizing force in terms of Bitcoin ownership, in terms of economic power in the network? Because a node that controls a lot of Bitcoin and can move it in the event of a chain split, like, economic nodes are a thing. Like, this does matter. My node is not the same as Coinbase's node. It's just not the case. I'm just curious if you guys see any sort of kind of risk there for us down the line.
I think that it's really important as Bitcoin educators to, number one, acknowledge that, like, there's no situation where 8 billion people are self-custodying Bitcoin, like, on the base layer. But we need to reach the people who have the capability to self-custody. There is an economic cost to doing that, which is, fronting the money for a wallet, and there's a technical know-how that you need to get to. And the optimal way of doing it is probably through multi-sig, so you need to make sure that you have people that you can trust. But we need to meet those people and really motivate them to choose self-custody if they're fully capable of doing it, over leaving it with custodians like BlackRock. Because it's just the convenience model right now. It wins every single freaking time, and the ETFs and the MicroStrategy are the convenience model. And there's just a lot of people out there, and that's kind of the mission of what we've been trying to do with Get Base TV, is to, like, find those people that can take that responsibility and to really, like, act on it as much as possible. So that we don't end up in a situation where you have too many centralized forces. I think there's just a lot of misconceptions about how difficult it is to self-custody Bitcoin. I think there's also a side of people in the Bitcoin space that say everyone should do it. It's super easy, blah, blah, blah. Like, you have no excuse. And it's like, there's a middle ground there, and we need to just, like, find the right people, that can self-custody with their Bitcoin and really push them to do so.
Yeah. I mean, my take on it is, right, we're already sitting at, 19.7 million of the supply has been mined. And, we had this discussion in that Twitter Spaces I told you about, where it's basically me and a couple other, like, quasi Bitcoiners who they somehow half get it and also half don't get it, arguing about this. And they, people were saying, hey, there's another 2 million to be mined, so the network is compromised. So I was like, how are you ignoring the 19 million that's already been mined and already being held, right? Something like there's what, like 6 million unique addresses with, over 2 Bitcoin, and there's, millions and millions over 1 Bitcoin. And obviously even more than that between 0.1 and 1. And so we really have a network where there's already a huge amount of, small level holders, retail holders. And those holders are trimming, right? You see like the amount of addresses holding 1 Bitcoin, it started to fall every time there's a bull market, but it falls by 10%, it falls by 12%. Lynn Alden said this in her most recent newsletter. And it rebounds afterwards. So they trim some of their position, and then when the bear market comes back in, they all buy back in. And so what the market's telling you is people still obviously have a preference for owning Bitcoin as a store of value. And, I think that the ETFs getting in, the, Saylor getting in, I think the main risk this poses is a price risk and a narrative risk, where if Saylor blows up, or if the ETFs blow up, or some Bitcoin somehow, there's a hack where the custodian Coinbase gets compromised, you could see a situation where there's this narrative that comes out, Bitcoin is dangerous. Look at these renegade capitalists that lost billions of dollars on Bitcoin. You're an idiot. The Bitcoin price crashes to $30,000 or whatever, and everyone in the space says it's over, right? And my opinion would be that's the perfect time to stack sats. I'm going to work even harder and just buy even more, and because I know that these are temporary flush outs, right? It's just like FTX and Celsius. This is the system sometimes needs to clean itself out. And by no means am I saying Saylor's going to blow up or the ETFs are going to blow up. I'm just saying that I think that's like the main risk that they pose, because I think at this point that it's too late for them to actually compromise the network in a meaningful way. Even with 2% of the Bitcoin that Saylor has, right? He can't affect all the consensus rules. He can't change the miners, block, what are they called? Paradigms, or I forgot the word for
templates?
it. But templates, yes. He can't. Yeah, he can't change that. And the block size wars prove that, right? Like even with a concerted effort at an early stage, they weren't able to change the block height or the block size. And so because they're not able to, right, like that makes this the perfect system to kind of be like that Trojan horse to enter the fiat system and kind of take it over for its own. Now, I don't love the idea of billionaires getting in, because I think they're already wealthy enough, which is why I think retail, we just need to stack as much as we can now, because there's only 1 to 1.5 million in free floating Bitcoin, meaning Bitcoin that's being actively bought and sold on exchanges. Once that dries up, right, who knows where the price will go? It'll have to go much higher to find sellers.
No, I think that's such an important point, because like if you have a significant amount of capital, you do not care if Bitcoin's at 100,000 or 200,000 or 300. Like it's actually a much safer bet for you. Like that looks good to you. Okay, this is a mature asset. Yep, I'm going to allocate 2 to 5% of my insanely large portfolio to this, and that part of my portfolio is going to carry the rest of it actually much more than I thought it would. Wow, isn't this great? I'm now even more exceptionally wealthy. But like they don't have a unit bias. You know what I mean? Like it's just they're just allocating a percentage. But for the average retail, honestly I hate the word retail. It just feels dumb. For the average fucking person, like 100,000 sounds like a really scary big number. It feels like you've missed the boat. But it's like I've only been in Bitcoin for 4 years, and I can say, wow. Every time Bitcoin started pumping, I was like, well, this will probably be the last chance I have to buy it cheap. But the reality is that if you go forward, 1 year, 2 year, 4 years, go through a full cycle, that's when you realize, oh no, it's always cheap right now when you're looking back 4 years later. Like Bitcoin is always going to be cheaper today than it is in 4 years. So you haven't missed anything. It's just, that takes some time to come around to that idea too, right? But that's, Julian, to your point, that's why education is so important. And to bring this back full circle, I think one of the most important things to educate people about is the problems with our current system. And that's why I'm super stoked that you guys made this film, because until you understand just how dark and just how broken our monetary system is, you may not have the tools necessary to understand why you need Bitcoin so much. And I want to again bring it back to the doc a little bit just before we close out. I want to be conscious of y'all's time. What do you hope people get out of this as this film is coming out? What do you and I guess is this a film that you really hope kind of reaches out just into the normie world? Like, I think it has the potential to, because it's it's an accessible film. But what do you hope that people take from this? Who were you thinking about as your audience when you made this?
It's hard because it's a super dense story, and you'll see it when you come out and you can come to your own opinion on it. But my intention with all the content with Get Based is I think that you can't understand or appreciate Bitcoin until you reprogram and you rewire your brain to have a low time preference. And so there's a lot of different ways to get there. You've seen my shorts. I try and explain concepts in very high time preference ways because I think it's just it's a bridge, right, to get to the low time preference stuff. But my hope from all of this is that slowly, piece by piece, there's a lot of sacrifice in one's day-to-day and one's routines and habits to get to an area where you choose, the low time preference way of thinking and going. And I think the more that I can just hammer that into people through interesting films that make you think twice and things that entertain you, and seeing how I've gone on that journey myself from being a pretty high time preference individual to working towards being a low time preference individual, I hope through all that journey, people will eventually go there. And that's, once you're there, then Bitcoin becomes a lot easier to understand. You just have to rewire people's brains slowly and surely. And I think this is a pretty cool part and a cool way of doing it, because I just think that this story in particular is just not something, and you're just never going to be taught it in school. You're never going to be taught it in your favorite movie. You have to learn it somewhere, and I think the somewhere that people learn nowadays it's YouTube, right? And it's Twitter, and it's seeing these things in 30-minute formats, and it's seeing these things told from 3 or 4 people, and especially Ian, who's really broken through, kind of the social media echo chamber to really bring these interesting values through his content. And so I'm just so stoked that we got this crew assembled. There's a levity to it. There's some intrigue. There's some conspiracy theorying inside the film. And I just hope people enjoy the ride and kind of arrive to where they need to arrive to see that Bitcoin's the solution to a lot of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on the same page. I've been studying macroeconomics, finance, the Fed for the last 8 years, 9 years at this point, and the further you dive down this rabbit hole and the further you study econ, you realize how much of our world is just warped and distorted and broken because of this, right? Even the economics profession itself, right? They are the foremost propagandists of Keynesian economics and the existence of the Fed, and so they've kind of indoctrinated an entire generation of economists to believe in this, and it's going to take a lot of hard discussions to unprogram and to reconfigure people's minds to realize the truth. And I think, this is coming whether we like it or not, right? The inflation is going to come back. We're going to see, more wars, more government spending, more debasement, more chaos, because that's just the nature of the cycle. We're at 130% debt to GDP. We can't get it. You can't get out of this in any way other than either devaluation or depression, and the Fed does not want to allow depression under any circumstances because that puts the banking system at risk. So they're going to opt for inflation, and that will finally, I think, open people's eyes to the evils of the system, and hopefully docs like this one will be right there to show people, hey, this is the reason why you're in a world of constant debasement and constant theft of your life force, of your energy, of your time, and this is why it should change. And that would hopefully orange pill some more people and add to the Bitcoin movement. So I'm very hopeful for that.
Just because Julian said the words conspiracy theory, and I said I would get back to this, did J.P. Morgan know the Titanic was going to sink?
I have a hard time with that one.
I'm just asking the question.
I have a hard time with that one because the idea is that there were 3 bankers on that boat that were anti-central bank. However, there's zero evidence that they made any statements about that. I don't know where that assumption came from, but the conspiracy is that 3 anti-central bank bankers were on the Titanic, and it was a planned demolition to get them out of the picture in the conversation around the Federal Reserve. I just don't have the evidence. If someone can link it to me, but like I dug deep on that. There's another weird conspiracy in the film, which you'll see, which is the dead bodies and stuff. That one I was willing to kind of like chew through a little bit more, but the Titanic one not so much.
Wait, what about the dead bodies? Sorry.
The Rockefeller's house is built on top of let's just say where some sacrifice. I'm pretty positive took place. And I think they were aware of it.
that was a dark part of the film for sure. I was not aware of that particular storyline, and it was a little bit disturbing.
Yeah, well, that's how you should feel. That's the Fed for you. Disturbing.
Well, it is coincident, right? Because again, the National Reserve Act, right? So they met in December 1910 to plan the National Reserve, which later became the Federal Reserve. They they lobbied Congress, they put forth the act, and in January of 1912, it was shot down. And then in April of 1912, the Titanic sank. And those bankers who were on the Titanic, even though they didn't have public statements, I believe that they had voted against the act. And, behind closed doors, at least in the National Monetary Commission, they had been, in opposition to it. So we don't have the problem is it's one of those things where it's like it could be a coincidence, and as far as I can tell, same as Julian, I couldn't find a direct link where it's like, oh, here's a letter from J.P. Morgan ordering for bombs to be put in the mailroom of the Titanic.
For sure.
Yeah, there's nothing like that, but there's just it's a weird coincidence. It's an interesting weird coincidence, and it could be true. Who knows?
Well, the weird part for me is like J.P. Morgan was supposed to be on the Titanic, and then he got sick a couple days before, and then decided to stay. But then he was like seen out and about making public appearances, so like clearly like not that sick. And didn't he own the he owned it was like the White Star Line or something? He had various interests in the construction and operation of the Titanic as well. I'm just asking questions here. I have no idea, but I think it's also an interesting thing where it's like, we can't find any evidence on this, but it's like, man, at that time, it's not like the internet existed where like a piece of information could get out there and then be really hard to like forever delete. It's like if you're one of the wealthiest people in the world and you also have ownership stakes in all of the media companies, and you also have ownership stakes in the cruise lines and the construction companies, and you literally, own a giant bank, it's pretty easy to make sure that a story is spun whatever way you want and that there is no evidence to the contrary.
I just feel like there's like a lower budget way to pick off all those bankers that probably would have made more sense than like, we're going to destroy this boat with like hundreds of other innocent civilians,
The question is, what kind of insurance policy was there on the boat? That's what you really have.
I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Again, just asking questions.
And if you think about it too, it's a great coincidence, right? You can always hide behind the accident, right? To get that amount of wealthy people in the same room, if you just had an assassin go in and shoot them, it's clearly targeted. But if they all get on a boat and it's this maiden voyage and they're sitting first class and then the boat sinks, very easy to have plausible deniability around this.
Well, you should tell the subtlety part to the CIA. They didn't get so good with the whole subtlety thing. We're seeing all these people picked off left and right, and it all looks so suspicious. Maybe they could. The CIA could learn from J.P. Morgan if that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, they literally invented the term conspiracy theorist, so at least they have that going for them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it wouldn't. Again, none of this would surprise me because I was recently doing some research on J.P. Morgan and Tesla and how J.P. Morgan had funded Tesla's research at Wardenclyffe Tower, and then when Tesla wanted to create this free energy that would be available to all people wirelessly, and he didn't want to file for patents for the radio or any of his other inventions. J.P. Morgan decided to pull funding because he wanted money. He wanted to produce he wanted his investments to make income, and so he pulled all of his funding from Tesla, basically sabotaged and blacklisted him from all of the private equity investors, and then he went and funded Edison and Edison's other compatriots, who basically plagiarized his DC AC current work, and then stole it, monetized it, and profited from it. And Tesla was left, he died broke and penniless, and his possessions were seized by the FBI and by private bankers, apparently, again in a conspiracy, because they sent his belongings back to Europe and to his son, and when it arrived there were like 10 crates of his belongings missing, and no one knows where they went. So the conspiracy is that JP Morgan stole them upon his death, or JP Morgan's
that's why
son.
Satoshi stayed anonymous.
Exactly.
Wait, there's another
I gotta
I
bounce
believe
in
that
2 minutes.
yeah. Well, I'll wrap, but look into this, and later if you feel like it. I believe it was Donald Trump's grandpa, who was like the extremely long tenured MIT professor, and he was the one who was in charge of like the invention part of the estate of Tesla when it was given to MIT. There's a whole different rabbit hole to go down there. We won't get into it. I appreciate you guys coming on here. This was super fascinating. I encourage everyone to check out the film when it comes out. Where do you want to send people? Where should they go watch it? I'll make sure to link it in the show notes.
Yeah, Twitter X at GetBaseTV. It'll be posted there hopefully a week or so from now. I don't know when the recorded edited version of this will come out, but for the live viewers, a week from now. And then on YouTube as well. We prefer if you watch it on YouTube because we self-fund this entire thing and we get ad revenue from that. So at GetBaseTV on YouTube as well.
Awesome. And I'll link you guys on X and Nostr as well. But seriously, thank you guys for the time. I'm going to try to get this out this evening, actually, once the wife and son go to bed. But this was a great time talking with you guys. I hope this encourages more people to go down more rabbit holes. And thank you guys for going so deep down this Federal Reserve rabbit hole, because it is a fascinating one. Appreciate you guys.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having us. I really appreciate it, Walker.
Thanks for the invite.
And that's a wrap on this Bitcoin Talk episode of the Bitcoin Podcast. If you are a Bitcoin-only company interested in sponsoring the Bitcoin Podcast, head to bitcoinpodcast.net/sponsor or send an email to hello@bitcoinpodcast.net. If you are enjoying the Bitcoin Podcast and find it valuable, give it a boost on Fountain, a 5-star review wherever you're listening, or better yet, share this show with your network so more people can learn about Bitcoin. Or don't. Bitcoin doesn't care, but I sure do appreciate it. You can grab links in the show notes to watch or listen to this show wherever you get your podcasts, or go to bitcoinpodcast.net/podcast. And you'll also find the links to follow me and the show on Nostr and on X. Bitcoin is scarce. There will only ever be 21 million. But Bitcoin podcasts are abundant. So thank you for spending your scarce time to listen to the Bitcoin Podcast. Until next time, stay free.